Hey everyone, welcome to the Notary Governance Call for March 30th, 2021. I just noticed our slide says 2020. So we got to get that updated, but new year. I'm excited to have you all. But yeah, today's agenda is pretty packed. We've got a bunch of topics around content updates, stuff around notaries and notary elections, and then of course the usual open issues, space for questions and discussion, etc. Let's start out with the content stuff. Kevin, do you want to talk to this real quick?
So here's where we stand right now with the frequently asked questions doc. Last turn the sync, we told you that this was coming. We made some modifications internally based off like other people's comments and feedback. So now this link is live. So if you look at it here in the doc, you can click on that. It's a Google Doc, which allows you to comment on it. What we're looking for is your feedback. If somebody was new to the program, does this address some of the main questions? And what we're hoping to do is take that burden off of you so that it can actually be floated into questions, into the Slack. And once you've had a chance to look at it, the next phase is we're going to broaden this out to the repo that we have. Then after that, we'll be putting it actually in the Fill Plus room for even wider dissemination on feedback. And then that way we have ideally an all-encompassing doc that can walk us through all these points. So if you haven't clicked on this link, you'll see it right here on the top doc, that Google. Everybody should have comment permissions to go ahead and give me feedback. The feedback that we're looking for again is, does the question actually, or does the answer to the question actually like give somebody enough to be tactical? We didn't want to go too deep in the weeds on this, but does it hit home on what needs to be said? And then is there anything that we missed? Have you heard some frequently asked questions, or have you had questions that come up and that we should include in this doc? Again, the goal was not to make this a 400 item frequently asked question, but just the key points. That way we can share this with somebody coming up. So feedback's open, feedback's welcome, and thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, it would be great to get as many eyes and hands on this as possible. As you know, this community is constantly growing. There's more and more people who are entering the Filecoin-Plus ecosystem, and so we'd like to create resources and better documentation and stuff. And so this is one important piece to ensure that we publish soon, just so that those people that we often see some of the questions be asked, this becomes a resource that all of us can use to help people that we know or people that we see ramping up in the community would have access to as they learn more about Filecoin-Plus and how they can engage and conduct themselves in the system. Second bullet, brief shout out. We finally have a playlist as of I think the last call actually, but not all of you were there at the last call, so just want to call it out briefly. But on YouTube, under the Filecoin account on YouTube, you can basically find a playlist called the Notary Governance Calls, and everything starting in February onwards will be recorded and uploaded there, so you'll have access to it. The last bullet is on the Filecoin-Plus Day Summit. So this is currently now planned for May 11th, which is, as you'll notice, also a Tuesday and also a day on which we would have had a notary governance call, and that was intentional. So the current operating plan is, we basically have a half day, maybe 3 to 4 hour long summit with two goals in mind. One is to help create high quality education content for people that are looking to participate in the ecosystem and learn more about Filecoin-Plus. So sessions on the history, the context, why it's important, where it's headed, some of the governance challenges we faced along the way, and the learnings that we've had. And then a second category or a secondary goal basically to serve as a platform where people in the community are able to showcase work that they've done. So we've seen some pretty cool things in the last couple of weeks where people have been shipping reputation systems, dashboards, interesting tools for helping notaries get through faster. Andrew is even pinging people in Slack with stats on GitHub. So these are all really interesting examples of things that we're doing together as a community to improve our processes and our efficiency. And so it would be great if we can use this as an opportunity to effectively bring this in a shared context with sessions. And so a lot of you have been very active, and I'm sure a lot of you would have great ideas and suggestions for topics and things you'd like to share. So as we figure out what the schedule will look like and things like that, please reach out to me on Filecoin Slack. We're going to be starting the process of curating and identifying what needs to happen and what the day may look like. And so the ask to you is, think about if either of those topics is interesting to you, either doing a session on education or showcasing your experiences or tooling and work that you've done. And then let's get it in to our planning for what this summit could look like. Hopefully this will be the first of many summits as well. So, but we definitely want this to be a nice solid start to the way in which Filecoin-Plus will move forward. Cool. Notary updates. So this is an action-packed session in my opinion for today. The first is just covering data cap movements. It looks like, especially with XN Matrix publishing their guidance and 1475 and Fenbushi having a lot more traction with applications in China, and then just in general, notary responsiveness going up on GitHub. We're seeing that data cap allocations are going up. 2 notaries are still blocked. So Masaki Nawatani from Protocol Japan and Math Wallet are still blocked. But I have good news, which is that both the messages that will unblock them are now with root key holders as of this morning. And so hopefully it should be another day at most until they're unblocked. And at that stage, every notary should be able to be making allocations. And in general, just looking at some highlights from the last week, and this is something I'd like to start tracking with historicity as well. And so we can aggregate our output as a community over the next several months. But yeah, I just looked through the GitHub issues and a couple of the applications that were coming in. It looks like last week we had 10 allocations go out. There were about 20 applications that were closed. 10 of them were closed because of timeouts or clients acknowledging that was an accidental application, but half of them were valid applications that were granted data cap. And then during the same period of time, about 15 new applications came in. And so ideally, we'd want this number to be the same. And ideally, we'd want this number to be high, but definitely making progress in this direction. So thank you, notaries, for those of you that have been stepping up, being more proactive, doing a better job ensuring that people that are applying are getting data cap. On that note, I also wanted to have a little bit of a discussion on what it meant to be an effective notary in the ecosystem, especially how it pertains to elections and things like that as well in the future. But just scoping the conversation to what we consider as active notary practices or good notary practices. I put down a couple of bullets, but really this is more as a prompt to get the conversation going, especially with other notaries, but also the rest of you in the community who are watching and learning from the experiences of the notaries. So for me, I think a good or active notary is somebody who's responsive on applications, such that the time it takes for a client to get data cap is reduced. Somebody who's actually actively making allocations and allocation decisions, and is also finding ways to improve decisions in the processes around governance for Filecoin-Plus. This is, of course, a very basic description of what I think would describe a good active contributor as a notary in the ecosystem. I'd love to hear some more answers. I know many of you have been doing thinking around how we can be more effective as notaries. Last governance call, we shared a couple of issues that Andrew raised around how we can ensure notaries continue to stay active over time and ways in which we can track notary success. I'd love to hear if there are any other thoughts on this particular topic, because I think this will become an important thing for us to align on as we think about the next round of notaries that we'd like to bring in. So on that note, I'd like to open up the floor for a few minutes and see if there are any ideas or thoughts, especially from other notaries, on how they'd like to define what active and good notary practices are. Yeah, Zihao.
Okay, so so for the first point, the time to data cap, I mean, it's quite hard for others to define it, especially for some cases that we have encountered today. Because for some of the application, they just opened the issues on GitHub, and so based on the guideline, we require them to send us some materials to us, but it takes a lot of time for them to prepare all those materials. So I mean, it's hard to define this that we are not responsible. We didn't respond to them, or it's the client's problem.
Yeah, I agree with that, because the amount of time that they take to respond to your questions is really what will be perhaps the longest factor. But I think maybe what we measure is I don't think this needs to be a strict metric, But one of the things that we were talking about in the last call was like, oh, what's the reasonable amount of time for like a notary to respond to a client application? Then what's the reasonable amount of time for the client to respond back? Because at that stage, we should also do a more active effort of just like closing out issues. Like just looking at our repo right now, I think the issue count is like in the mid 60s, which is quite high. And a lot of them are basically clients that are taking like a lot of time to get back to questions that are being asked from notaries. And so we talked about like maybe like a reasonable amount of time for notary to respond is like in the magnitude of like a week, like 3 to 5 days kind of a thing. And then a client should also respond maybe in a similar or maybe like 2 weeks ish. And if in that stage they're not responding, then it might be worth like closing out the issue. But yeah, I agree with you. I think the measurement and like the way we should track this from a notary perspective is the responsiveness of the notary. The overall time to data cap is a metric that I think the entire ecosystem should care about, but I 100% support that it's not entirely in your control.
Yeah. Yeah, especially like when we contact the clients, we use the email. So I mean, it's very hard to track that. If like everyone doing that on GitHub, it'll be like trackable. But I mean, like for some clients, they're like very not used to like using GitHub. Like especially for some early cases, like I wrote to them on the GitHub to like let them to provide me and like email address, and like after a month or 2 months, they just didn't reply me on GitHub. So I mean, it's quite hard to like communicate with them just directly on the GitHub.
That is interesting. And I've seen that there's some due diligence processes that happen with WeChat as well, right? And tracking both of those is pretty difficult.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. I'd love to hear the other suggestions. Philip, I see that you have a hand.
No, I was just going to add something here because I think it's an interesting point, right? Kind of like the entire diligence process currently is built on GitHub. And GitHub per default is open, and kind of like one of the core principles of the program is that it's an open program, and sort of like we should pay it forward with trust. So I think to that end, it's interesting to think through. Basically we're in this infancy stage where many of these different clients effectively are people like ourselves. So are probably mostly technically minded, but as we kind of grow as an ecosystem, we'll have many more people that may not either want to engage on GitHub or cannot engage on GitHub. So there may be some abstraction or some kind of tooling that needs to be built over the long term. But I think one thing that I just wanted to mention in relation to like the prior comment is that I think it totally makes sense to actually also engage sort of like offline, as in not in the open and public and kind of like have a meeting. But I think it's important to document that, and then sort of like as a notary, if you engage in a meeting, if you had an email conversation, set the expectation that is to be made public, or at least parts of that should be public, and then that is manifested on GitHub. I think sort of like the expectation should be that the notary, if he or she is serving clients that are not native to GitHub or don't want to use GitHub, that they didn't kind of like follow up and make that trail visible.
Thoughts on that? Ziyao, if you have any, what do you think? Is that like feasible? Might mean that every time you have a conversation outside of GitHub, you're then posting your notes from it.
Yeah, it will be like quite like costing our time to do that, because like we had emails like every day. I mean, to ask materials. I mean, like especially for us, we require clients to send us like a lot of materials to us, and so for some reason they need to, I mean, to send us the materials again and again, because we are not satisfied with some of the materials they have sent to us. Yeah, so I mean, we can do that, but it will cost us a lot of times.
Interesting. Andrew, I see you have a hand. Oh, sorry, Philip, you unmuted. Go for it, and then we should also give Andrew a chance to speak.
Please, Andrew, go ahead. My comment is not as important.
Oh. Hand is down.
Oh, I don't want to like distract you, Philip. So why don't you finish your thought here?
Okay. I was just going to maybe push back a little. I think yes, you have sort of like a diligence process that is in an email chain, and you may kind of like have a conversation that is on on sort of like a video or so, maybe even in person, who knows. But I do think, again, given that it's an open program and given that we have to pay it forward as trust, maybe this becomes less important over time as there's more automation and more tooling available that, eases that, burden or workload for you as a notary. But I still think it's important, specifically in the current stage, to, try to pay it forward with trust and really kind of like make that as public as possible. So I don't think it won't be necessary to really document the entire email chain or whatever. But maybe, it could be even sort of like it could be sort of like a comment, I talked to this person in person or via video, answer these 3 key questions, and that's it. But I do, think it's important that the majority of, or at least kind of like there's a trail that is visible that folks can look at, as opposed to kind of like, that just happening in the dark.
Yeah, sure. I think we can do that. I mean, just like having comments on the GitHub that we like said, we have already contacted them, and like it's in process, so we can totally do that. Yeah, without like putting any records on it. If a community requires us to like prove that we are like we did like email them, like we can also prove that and like put record on it. It's okay for us, but it's on request.
Yeah, I think that's reasonable. Maybe the starting point then is just putting a comment that says we reached out over email and we're waiting for a response. And then if further documentation is asked, because we want to, like, based on how the client is behaving, maybe, right? Then on that basis, maybe like a screenshot of some of the emails might be helpful. But yeah, I think the sort of the lower friction, we've reached out on email, just update is probably good. And then that can also help as we like actively track like the concept of getting to data cap and things like that within the community.
Yeah,
Is
sure,
that
I
okay?
agree. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, we can do that, as long as like we like I mean, it takes too much time on the, I mean, for some applications, so we will just say like we are in contact with them. Like we can totally do that.
Yeah, right. Perfect.
Mhm.
Andrew?
Yeah, sure. I think that's awesome conclusion. Totally agree with all the sentiment there about pushing towards transparency and making it open. But I wanted to actually come back to the time to data cap piece, because one of the important pieces, I think that was something that I initially had proposed. And if you're working in GitHub, there should be ways that we could parse out whether the time was with the client or the notary. But at the end of the day, I don't think it matters, because I think the purpose of measuring this isn't always to measure the quality of the notary, it's to measure the quality of the onboarding experience. And if that time to data cap is really high and not coming down over time, then we're doing a bad job. So tracking this through time, I think, is going to be important, and not thinking of it as like, oh, my time to data cap is really high and everybody else is really low. This is a measure of how bad I am compared to everybody else. This is a measure of us as notaries and improving the Filecoin onboarding ecosystem through time. And are the decisions we're making on these calls and on GitHub improving that time? We need to measure that. And so, yeah, I just think that I think we need to collect it and actually and collect it someplace on GitHub or elsewhere where we can track that through time across all the notaries.
Yeah, I think that generally makes sense, and I think most people are supportive of that. I actually really thought it was good. Andrew, you were posting for a couple of days, like the average sort of issue stats and stuff as well. I thought it was great, but I'm also not a notary, and so I'd love to hear opinions from other notaries on if
the other thing is like, if we just start posting it and start putting our eyes on it, we'll start improving that measurement and say, okay, right, what other tools do we need to make that measurement more accurate, to collect the different dimensions of it? But we have to start somewhere. And so, yeah, I think the key thing is we can't use this measurement as a measure of quality of the notary. We just need to use this measurement as the quality of the onboarding experience for the clients, and start improving it.
Yes. Okay. Agree. That makes sense to me. So actually, it shouldn't be a metric under this section, but it needs to be like a metric for the community, and that makes sense to me.
Totally.
Yeah. Any other thoughts on this and just general good notary practices?
I have a question. Once the data cap is used up, do we apply for new ones, or
That's a great question. Yeah, so we'll address that right in the bullet below this and talk a little bit about it.
Okay.
Yeah, so maybe Dr. Ann, let's give the room like a minute or two to see if there are any other topics on this particular section, and then let's chat about that.
Okay, thanks.
Cool. Okay, let's talk about this concept of an election. So the first time we did this, we opened up like an application form where, you know, we had about 30 applications or something like that. I think it was like 30, 32 or 36. One of them was a repeat application, which is from the Filecoin Foundation, but all the other applications were new. And the only reason we had a repeat was because we had done some testing and needed to make sure that the flows worked. The interesting thing here, though, is that like we conflated the two concepts in that process. So one is there's a separate path within this, which is if you've already been elected as a notary and you're demonstrating that you're a good notary, and in general the community believes you're a good notary, then maybe you should just be able to go and get more data cap, as like Dr. Ann is saying. And then there's this second construct of, oh, you have an unproven track record, you want to participate in this program, you should get the chance to apply once every, you know, X amount of time, which is deemed reasonable, either based on like outstanding data cap or like a schedule or whatever we think the appropriate process is. And there's a bunch of conversation around this in like the December-January timeframe. I think it was like issue number 76 or something, where people going back and forth on how to time like concepts like elections. But in general, like one thing that I think we've learned through this process is that there's not a lot of like consistency in the rate at which like data cap gets allocated across the board. Of course, people have different due diligence processes. Client demands are different. We've also learned a lot about how to do due diligence, I think, and processes that become more efficient over time. But yeah, like in general, it's been relatively like high variance. Like we've got notaries today that have run out of data cap, and then we've got notaries that because of like technical issues haven't even started issuing data cap. And so having like this like blanket sort of, oh, we need to do a round of elections and everybody needs to, regardless of whether or not they're existing, and need to get a top up, versus those that want to be elected as new notaries need to go through the same system on the same schedule, and like all data cap is like blocked on this, to me doesn't feel like the most effective and efficient path. So I have some ideas that I'd like to propose, but before I do that, I wanted to hear if there were any already from other notaries, other members of the community in the room, if you had suggestions on how we can be approaching this problem. If you also like agree or disagree with the framing that I've put here, because this is obviously one opinion in the community. So I would love to hear if there are people that disagree or would like to reframe this.
Yeah, I think probably starting the new application process would make more sense. Because like you said, it's consistency would be an issue if, you know, like, you know, how do you validate the same notary keeps on getting more database. I mean, what's the consistency and criteria? So probably starting a new application process would make more sense.
Yeah, and the rubric today does have a row for like retroactive, like accounting for previous activity as a notary, basically. So if you like effectively allocated some amount of data cap in the past, then you get like additional points in your app. And so the likelihood of getting reelected also continues to increase. What the gating sort of criteria in the first round of elections was like this idea that we had on like wanting to have a consistent amount of notaries distributed across the world. So then is the suggestion that we just do the election, we pick the election based on like some metric that we agree on, like, you know, the amount of data cap that exists, and then we just keep increasing the number of notaries that are that we strive for in each region. So right now, for example, that we had started with the number 3, and then because of ties, there are more than 3 in China and North America. But in general, there are 3 notaries. Is the conversation then that, oh, like once we get to like, I don't know, 10% of remaining data cap, we need to do another round of notary elections, and we're going to increase the number of notaries this time from like target number of 3 to target number of 5 or something like that, or even more. Is that what you're proposing, Dr. Ann?
sorry, mute, muted. Yes, something like that. Yes.
Cool. Any other opinions on that? Would love to hear. Okay, so I think that definitely is one path that we should consider going down, and was probably like the original path that we had in mind in many ways. And so I think that is reasonable and makes sense. The other thing that I was considering is that there's a allocation rate difference as well across regions. And so a couple of issues were filed about this, and we did discuss them in the last like couple of calls. I think at some point, somebody raised that like for whatever reason, data cap allocations in China were going slower, but I think that should be solved now, given all the notaries have come online and have very clear guidance and principles at this stage. But it does show that at some stage where basically Europe is effectively run out of data cap and other regions is just starting to deploy data cap, that like doing this election process as on an across the world basis may not work, or but at the same time, we don't want to create like data cap disparity where like a region is favored just because notaries were getting rid of data cap like faster. And so I don't know what the right measure is for when we should kick off a new election. My initial instinct was to propose something around percentage of remaining data cap between like what was allocated in the last round and what's left. But I'd love to hear the other opinions on this, the suggestions on this. It might be that we're more proactive just to make sure, because there's obviously a lag induced by the applications coming in as well. Philip, I saw that you'd unmuted. Did you have anything you'd like to share?
Yeah, I was just thinking, because from like a purely technical point of view, it's kind of difficult to align everyone on sort of like a new top up date, because we can't yet top up addresses. Is that correct?
That is correct. For
Right.
clients at least, yeah. And so I assume for notaries as well.
Right.
But I do
So
want to add that FIP 12 was passed last week. And so that was the other point of talking for this bullet, was that top-ups are going to be supported. It's come up in the implementer sync. Lotus has agreed on a schedule to implement it by the next actors update, which is slated for, I think, sometime in June at this point. And I'm still waiting to hear what the plans are from some of the other implementations. But yeah, it will be supported in the near future, but not for this round of elections, is my guess.
Got it. Because once kind of like that happens, we can kind of like think through like developing a more flexible framework that is more individualized on like if a notary say drops below 20%, then he or she can just flexibly reapply, and then maybe there's ways to kind of like batch it to make sort of like the workload more easy for the folks that are evaluating these applications or these top-ups. But I think until then, we'll probably, I think it's a great idea to kind of like look at the total percentage of data cap spend on a notary side or across all notaries, and take that sort of like as a cut-off point to kind of at least start the process, right? Because I think it also takes some time, and I think maybe it's worthwhile talking about that process as well. And I think sort of like the second thing that we could do, just to get a pulse on what's happening within the notary community, is to like just maybe have a Slack poll, perhaps on a kind of like seems like there's a lot of velocity, less velocity, or a lot of just no velocity, just to get a sense for how fast people are spending their data caps as notaries. I don't know if that's an interesting or valuable data point ultimately, but maybe for this transition period, it could be worth exploring.
Yeah, that's interesting. Any other notaries or thoughts on that? So effectively, you're proposing that we use like a little bit more subjective data as well to ensure that like we're getting the timing of this correctly.
Yep. I think maybe also we can start thinking about just from like a purely, less from like an individual, but purely from like a program perspective, or like a Filecoin project perspective. What do we want to avoid? What we probably want to avoid is that we run out of available data cap in a certain geography, and specifically those geographies where you see a lot of demand from clients. So we should somehow kind of like be flexible towards sort of like the broader demand, and I think we should align. We should really align kind of like what is best for the entire Filecoin project and ecosystem versus sort of like individual notaries.
Yeah, I think one manifestation of that was basically once certain notaries and regions were running out of data cap, the call was effectively made that other notaries in other regions were supporting taking applications from there. And so we've seen sort of the region-based boundary in some cases hasn't really been held as strongly, and that's probably a good thing because it is unblocking useful development and usage of the network. And so it also makes me like I understand why it's important. Like it is important to have geo-distribution in our notary selection, but the individual policies that each notary chooses to uphold in terms of the geographies that they choose to serve in terms of incoming client applications will also influence this pretty substantively, right? And then there was also this whole element of certain notaries prioritizing and serving specific types of use cases, and that sometimes requires additional like engineering work to be done. So like Kiko as a notary is still working on figuring out how they want to do their automated like multi-sig sort of solution for online websites being built. And as a result, there's no allocation. And so that also leads to some interesting and sort of difficult to build a general purpose solution around without like generalizing or simplifying the problem quite a bit. And so I guess the sort of ultimate like question here is like, can we align on a simplification that we think is reasonable, that we then use as a process and a method to continue to make progress in this direction? Charles, you mentioned that it seems NA region needs to onboard more clients. Do you mean in terms of like, in general, there are more clients in NA, or do you mean that NA applications are not going as
No.
quick?
Sorry. It's not an unclear sentence. I'm not saying that should give more clients. I mean that the ecosystem side, the entire ecosystem in the North America maybe needed to work a little bit to find more real customers who's willing to save data on the Filecoin network. So I'm talking with lots of friends and enterprise locally. A common scenario is that they have data, but they concerned about the security and the privacy. Because I don't know how it's in other regions, but in North America, when I'm talking with them about videos and some content, they really worry about the copyright, because if they save the content on the Filecoin network, it basically is open to the public. Anybody can retrieve it from the Filecoin and pay by Filecoins. But when they pay by Filecoins, they think it may be defined as a commercial behavior. So some videos like they get from YouTube was not it may be violated the license, so a copyright. But if they are using their own data, then another limitation is the data usually like if they encrypt it, I don't know how to pass the notary verification, and also when they split it on different miners, they also consider about is this safe enough. So this is something like I try to convince them it's safe to save the Filecoin, and but it's still they have doubts. So that's some difficulties that currently encountering when I'm trying to onboarding customers.
That's great feedback. I think that it makes sense. I've heard similar. One of the conversations I've had with people along those lines has been that they're also welcome to encrypt this stuff that they put onto the network. But yeah, I think it's a good point. There is space in the spec for like things around like content policy in terms of service and stuff, but I think some of those areas have not been fleshed out as well yet.
So my question is that so because I'm the minor of North America, right? So I'm not sure how to define myself, but when I was onboarding those customers, I think I'm more like a onboarding agent or something like that. So I kind of need some help of law about something related to the law, the local law, those kind of help, so I can explain to our customers that look, this copyright, if you are using this for education or other purpose, it's safe or something like that. I need this kind of legal service help. I'm not sure if foundation can provide some help of this, or we needed to find our own lawyer and pay them the consulting fee to do this, because this is very critical for us to onboarding. We are minors, very good in technology, but we're not so good in law and those kind of stuff.
Yeah, I would generally call this like category of work like business development for the network, which is like bringing in more interesting use cases to the network. I think those are very good points. Charles, respectfully, they're probably outside the scope of the current conversation, but I do think it's worth like talking about. Maybe we can chat about it a little bit further on Slack, or if other notaries would like to get involved. But I would propose you actually raise this as a conversation in the Filecoin-Plus channel on Slack, and let's get some opinions on it. To wrap up this sort of conversation, I think the general sentiment is that from what I'm seeing, we're probably reaching a time where we should start the process for another round of elections. If people have thoughts based on the conversation we had today on how that election should go, please share them. I'm gonna create an issue on the next round of elections, probably sometime this week, and so we can use that to finalize what we believe is a good process for it. And it would be great to aggregate some thoughts on that. With that, let's move over to the set of issues. I've divided them into two categories this time because I wanted to just explicitly align on next steps for one of them. So this issue was filed about 18 days ago. I think we talked about it in the last Notary governance call. There was some conversation about it on GitHub. There was a lot of conversation about it in the last governance call. The proposal is basically, it was from Andrew Hill. Andrew, if you don't mind, I'm just going to speak for it in the interest of time for like 30 seconds. But the proposal is basically to get the auto verifier that was shipped by Infinite Scroll at verify.glyph.io up from 8 gigabytes to 32 gigabytes of data cap. And this was primarily to increase the amount of data cap available for testing purposes, make it easier and faster for people to get their initial allocation that they'd want to get started. And just generally reduce the friction for people that just need like a tiny amount of data cap to validate like their proof of concepts or validate things inside the ecosystem, because 8 gigabytes just ends up being way too little. And 32 seems like a good sweet spot where it's not too much that people will try to abuse the system. The verifier still has like a high bar, which is like a GitHub account that needs to be open for more than half a year, and they can only get that much data cap like once a month, etc. And so the reception to this proposal was incredibly positive last week. In the last call, which was 2 weeks ago. I haven't seen anybody flag any issues on GitHub other than let's figure out how we can do this. What I'd like to just open up the floor for 1 minute effectively is, does anybody think this is not a good idea? Because if we're generally aligned, I think we need to start moving forward towards implementing. We have a lot of proposals in general in the ecosystem. And so just moving towards implementing on a few of these that we're aligned on is something I'd like to push for. And I think this might be a really good one that we can pursue in the coming week. And so before we get that, sort of wanted to just open the floor up for any other opinions that weren't accounted for, or anybody thought that we should reconsider this as a community.
Maybe I'm very pro this, obviously, but maybe we can do it also as an experimental period of time and have them try to measure how much people try to game it, and we can review it over in some near term and decide to continue it or not.
Yeah, I think that sounds like a reasonable idea. I don't think Jonathan Schwartz is in this call. It would have been good to just get his opinion on whether or not that'd be difficult, but I think that's a good point. Andrew, if you want to flag it in the issue, that's probably a good suggestion. I was also going to propose that he goes and updates his notary application with the expected changes, because his notary allocation strategy fundamentally is going to change from his original allocation. And so for transparency and tracking purposes, like I view that as a blocker to him changing this. But it seems like we're generally aligned. This is an experiment worth running. And so I think we should proceed with next steps on this. Cool. If you have additional thoughts, please feel free to hit up issue 100 and share. Let's talk about open issues. And last time we went in this order, and we ended up not having as much time for the governance one. So I propose we go in inverse order. So for the governance sort of section that I've put here, the issues relating elections and data cap top-ups, etc. I think we've sort of had good conversation about that in the previous section of this call. And so I have nothing further to flag there. I wanted to give Nelson or NSC-Phil the floor to chat a little bit about the proposal 105.
Yeah, hi. So I basically came up with this idea only because we had a major dispute as minors in terms of self-dealing the data cap. So we need, I think it's imperative for the community as a whole, not just the Filecoin-Plus community, to voice their opinions on violations of rules in general first, and then also violations of rules and how we handle them. So one suggestion that I think Deep you put into the GitHub was to use the fill poll method to do polling to get the general opinion of the majority of community members on issues, and also how to maybe rectify or penalize people who have broken the guidelines or the rules. I think that's a good suggestion. And then what's most important is to actually get a framework in place to have enforcement for disputes or violations. I mean, it's one of the things that I'm finding difficult is to really figure out what the actual guidelines for use of data cap, or from a miner's perspective. There's no real like anything written down. No, it's just pretty much discussions in different places, Slack and GitHub. So it would be good to have one place where everybody could understand what their roles are and the guidelines to, and also the ramifications if those guidelines aren't handled properly.
Yeah, and just to share some additional context, Nelson, correct me if I'm wrong, but the conversation that you're referring in the context around like guidelines, this primarily came up because there were cases in which people were both clients and minors, and so this is not like the self-dealing conversation if you're a notary, but rather if you allocate data cap to a client that then goes and stores that data with themselves, you effectively have like a world where the network is subsidizing somebody for something they already have on their hard disk, etc. But at the same time, it's important to ensure those valuable use cases are being brought into the network. And so the conversations we had in the past were like, what is the reasonable degree to which that should be supported? I'd opened up, I think it was like issue 98, if I remember correctly, which was like, oh, like, can we propose like some kind of percentage to which this is acceptable, depending on the presence of miners in a particular region where that data needs to be stored. And so there was some active conversation on that a couple of weeks ago. But it's hard to arrive to a decision on controversial topics like that because we don't have a clear decision-making sort of framework. Is that fair? Is that a fair?
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, that's how I think it's the discussion is good, that, and I think that it's in different pockets right now. Like sometimes on Slack, sometimes on GitHub, sometimes just in DMs, and people have different, obviously very different perspectives and understandings, and sometimes they there are violations, but it may just be out of ignorance. The point is, we probably should have a more mechanized method to really hammer out what the actual guidelines are. For instance, if a client, in the case that this issue came up for me, was if a client is also a miner and then they start to deal all of their data cap to their own mining operation, there's many people who say that's fine, that's just the way the market works, and then the other people who say that that's not fair. But in general, we've never really done a poll or a vote on that, and so some people are doing it, some people are not. I mean, I think it's good for the community as a whole, not just notaries and people in the Filecoin-Plus program, but the Filecoin-Plus program. It's for us to all have a clear guideline on these details, and then, but also, how do we enforce them when people actually blatantly violate the guidelines that we came up with as a community?
Yeah. So agree. I generally agree on all those fronts. I think it's a conversation worth having. I just saw a couple of people unmuted. Please go for it. Please take the floor. Never mind. Okay, please feel free to share thoughts, chat as well if you have them. So I think the second part of your question is a little, I think, clear in my opinion, which is like, what's the carrot, what's the stick to enforce? And I think pretty much that comes down to most clients that have legitimate use cases need data cap more and more in the future. Like they're typically not coming for like a single data cap allocation that's going to serve their like lifetime need. And so I think that the immediate and easy stick is just you don't get any more data cap, right? And that's probably like a really good way to incentivize decent behavior. I don't know if it's enough, but I definitely think it's enforceable and likely a good starting point as a mechanism to incentivize the right behavior. I think the bigger challenge is ensuring that everybody's on the same page with what that like right behavior actually looks like. And so, yeah, I'd love to hear if there are any opinions on mechanisms for arriving to that. I know we've got some folks from the Filecoin Foundation as well. Philip, if you want to speak to any thinking from that end, or at least I would urge you all to look at issue 105 and see if you can propose any suggestions for tactical next steps and how we can become more effective as a governing group and as a community.
How do we go about getting a poll done officially, like the one that was just done for on the Filecoin website?
That's a great question. I have some steps. I don't know how easy it is for just anyone to do it. As far as I know, it has to, like, they are typically aligned with FIPS. So I don't know if this would fall into the category of FIP or not, because it's just modifying like our practices for program. But I'm sure that there's a way. Nelson, maybe you and I can follow up offline with some of the people on the implementation like side of things who are working on the different Filecoin implementations, because that's typically the mechanism they'd be using. And so I'm sure we can find a way to leverage that.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm actually also curious because I know that the Filecoin polls tool that was proposed or announced recently is specifically for Filecoin network governance.
Yeah.
Wouldn't it be possible to also use it for certain elements of the Filecoin-Plus program, or we can just fork it and use it for, or you have a Filecoin-Plus poll version of it?
Yeah, that would have to be probably also changed, so it's not just based on power, based on
sure.
Agreed.
Sure.
And if we want to include, we should probably include all participants, including just node holders, miners, maybe wallet holders.
We would be happy to kind of like fund that work via a dev grant if someone wanted to fork it and adapt it for Filecoin-Plus. Just
awesome.
Contact me in Slack.
Yeah, fine for the Barnard. Okay, cool. I think that's an interesting concept and definitely something that I'd love to see built if possible. Nelson, thanks for pushing the conversation on this. The ask for the community, take a look at 105, think about if we should fork Filecoin and how we can make it more effective as a tool for the Filecoin-Plus ecosystem. Moving upwards, issue 94. This is originally proposed between JV and Sonic on this concept of onboarding projects with large data cap requirements. So I just proposed something yesterday, which I think could be an interesting like initial implementation of this, which is basically along the lines of having a massive like open application format for a client. And so like a client that has a use case that requires greater than 500 terabytes of data cap would apply using this like more global application similar to a Notary application, which should be open for everybody, and anybody from the community can help in the due diligence process. So let's say like an app is open for 2 weeks. During those 2 weeks, anyone in the community, any Notary or any community member can ask questions of that client, and we effectively vet that client together. Then we use whatever voting mechanism we choose, or have a conversation in a Notary governance call that deems that client to be like worthy of like a dedicated data cap faucet. And effectively that client can then go and ask for messages of like 100 terabytes at a time at most, like maybe per day or per week, where at least 4 out of 7 volunteered notaries have to sign on that message for that allocation to be made. So like combining some constructs of like just multi-sig, but also this notion of like how we've used root key holders as executors, we can now have notaries as executors, but also notaries that have volunteered to be watchful of the clients. Anyway, I don't want to go super in depth with this because I know we only have about 5 minutes left. But I did want to briefly explain that and encourage people to look at the issue. Julian, do you have anything you'd like to add?
No, I think it's a great idea. I didn't read your message on Slack, so sorry, on GitHub, so that's why. But I think yes, it's yeah, using the multi-sig. I think it's the a very good approach. What we just need to care about maybe is that this client may need a single point of contact in a way in one at some point, like. We may need to verify. I mean, he may need to have a single point of contact for all his notary's question. And if we just use the multisig and there is like 7 people that just signing just to allocate the data cap, maybe this would be maybe not enough. Like, I don't know if at one point we want to someone may need to audit what's happening for this customer, for this client. Who's going to take this role? I mean,
my assumption was that it would fall to that set of 7 notaries, because then at least 4 of them have to continue granting like data cap from that faucet. But you're probably right that we'll reach a stage where, because there are too many people with the responsibility, then nobody has responsibility.
Yeah, that's what I think. Yeah.
Okay, so then maybe there's like one notary sort of lead or champion sort of thing, like a captain in a way that like volunteers to be responsible for some of that auditing, as well as being the DRI for communications with the client, and also becomes the sort of main voice for the remaining notaries who may have questions on like the client's dealings and things like that.
Yeah,
I would love if you could add that suggestion in the conversation, and let's iterate on this soon. Yeah, because I'd love to sort of get to a place where we can have like a initial POC in the next couple of weeks as well. I know that, you know, Starling is looking for massive data cap allocation. I know some of the miners, as well as the notaries like 1475 in China, have been doing some incredible work with business development and brought on like 2 or 3 massive use cases that are all looking for like petabytes of data cap. So I think it's pretty good time to be building a mechanism like this.
Yeah, exactly. And I have, sorry, but just to come back to 105, I just have something to say about that. You said that maybe it's not going to be a FIP because it's not really related to the protocol. It's more like how we manage all of this in education. I had a side conversation with Jonathan and with Andrew last week and earlier this week. I think that if we have like a tribunal or something that to manage the dispute and so on, they need to be able to do some action. So, and one of the action that could be is that we can remove the data cap to someone who game the system. And I mean, removing what is already on chain on the existing sectors. Like we cancel the flag that said it's verified. And if we do that, I mean, I don't know, we need to discuss if what people think about this, but if we can do that, then this is going to be a FIP anyway.
FIP, yeah, that is true. That is true. Yeah, interesting. In the interest of time, I would propose let's have that conversation, the issue. I know Ziha has a hand up and we should wrap up soon. Thanks, Julian. That is completely valid. +1 makes sense. Thank you. Ziha, do you have anything you wanted to share?
Yeah, so like for these large data requirements, so should we do it like I mean by cross border or like by the specific regions? I mean, like if it's for the specific region, like so we can like ask all the notary in that regions to I mean execute on that requirements, and I mean it can like reduce the burden for other notaries in other regions. So I'm not sure. Yeah, we will do it like but to fulfill the requirement cross borders or yeah.
That's a great question. My instinct in the proposal was to have it cross-border. Like I would imagine that these are like massive use cases that are like fundamentally game changing, you know, in the way that they use the network and stuff as well. And so the initial like proposal for me is probably that it should be cross-border. I don't think that that needs to be what happens. So I'd love to hear the other opinions. If you think it's difficult to pull this off cross-border, please share that in the issue. If you think it's going to be difficult, especially because of language barriers or context or anything like that, I think that that is a valid concern and we should think about it. But my initial suggestion was like, let's find a way to ensure that it is like a global thing, because these kinds of use cases are so big and often will want to store data and replicate it outside one region for even just redundancy and reliability's sake. Cool. I think with that, I'm just going to give 30 seconds if anybody has any open topics. I know there are two other issues I flagged here, 103, 104. We sort of had the chance to talk about these in the previous call. Not so much in this call, Andrew, sorry we're out of time, but please folks take a look. Andrew, if you want to talk about them for 30 seconds, maybe the open discussion sort of is a good space for that. If not, I'm just going to say encourage folks to please go look at those issues and let's make sure we get to them on GitHub. Yep, cool. Unless there's any other topics, I don't want to keep you folks too late. Thank you so much as usual for making the time. This is a super productive call. Then we covered a lot of interesting topics. So this is great. Julian, anything you want to add?
Nope, just to say bye-bye.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.
Wonderful. I appreciate it. Once again, thank you so much, folks.